All right, so we're going to talk about migration and drift. So evolution is shaped by four forces: mutation, selection, migration, and chance. And generally when we are talking about chance, we're specifically talking about genetic drift. So earlier we talked about mutation and selection, and now we're going to talk a little bit about migration and chance, or genetic drift. What is migration? Migration is the movement of alleles between populations. From an ecological perspective, you can think of it as dispersal with subsequent reproduction. And then migration equals gene flow. So when you hear someone say or something say there's gene flow between populations, that means that there's migration between populations. Mutation and migration are the only mechanisms for regaining lost genetic diversity. So if we think back to the cheetah here on the left, when they went through their population decline, there weren't any other populations for them to mate with. So for them, mutation was the only way that they could increase genetic diversity over time. However, for the panthers here on the right, is a different story. So the number of panthers in Florida has been declining, and historically there was gene flow between Florida panthers and Texas panthers. So in 1995, they released 8 females from Texas into Florida, and they found that the population rebounded and the genetic diversity recovered immediately. So this is essentially an example of a managed migration, and it resulted ultimately in a genetic rescue. Genetic drift is the fluctuation of allele frequencies due to random chance. So to remember this, you can think of this beetle example. So if you have a beetle population, they have green and brown beetles, and then someone is walking by and they by chance happen to step on 2 green beetles, so they are removed from the population. So the population now has more brown beetles, and so the allele frequencies have actually changed in this population, but it's not because of any environmental feature or adaptation. Instead, what happened was it was just that the few lucky ones who happened to survive then survive and reproduce, and so they change their allele frequencies. And so this is a good way to remember genetic drift. It's essentially the random change in allele frequencies. It may seem like these random or chance effects would only have minor impact on the genetic composition of populations, but in small populations, this chance can have a really large consequences. And why is that? Essentially because genetic drift can lead to fixation of a certain allele, which then leads to the loss of the other allele. And ultimately, it leads to an overall loss of genetic diversity and reduced evolutionary potential. Also, in small populations, drift can override selection, meaning that the allele frequency is a result of chance rather than responding or adapting to environmental pressures. And so a bottleneck is one specific type of genetic drift. Here we have a picture that shows this. We have an original population with lots of individuals, and you can see that they have different alleles. This is based on their different colors. And they go through some catastrophic reduction in the population. And then there are a few chance survivors, and you can see that the chance survivors are blue and yellow, and that represents very different allele frequencies than the original population. When there is a bottleneck, only a proportion of the heterozygosity is lost, so a single bottleneck has to be quite severe or sustained over several generations before it has a substantial impact on heterozygosity. So for example, this is the Mauritius kestrel. This is a bird that lives on the island of Mauritius off the coast of Africa. And the main reason for the decline of this bird was due to deforestation, though there were other secondary impacts like weather, such as cyclones coming through, and also pesticide use, such as DDT affecting the eggs. And in the 1970s, there were fewer than 50 birds in the wild. And then that was subsequently reduced to a single male and a single female. And with the help of a Welsh biologist named Carl Jones, who was quite dedicated, he would climb trees and find the nests and then take eggs from the nests back to the lab and incubate them, and then rear these to hatching, and then later release the adults back into the wild. And eventually the population did recover. Now, when they did a genetic analysis of these individuals, they first took a sample of museum specimens, so this indicated the historic heterozygosity, and then they compared them to the heterozygosity of living birds, and they found that there was a reduction in heterozygosity by 57%, which is huge. It went from 0.23 to 0.10, and if you think back to what this means that 23% of the individuals were heterozygotes initially, and then that got reduced to only having 10% of the individuals that are heterozygotes. And so this shows you that the tremendous implications of a very severe bottleneck in terms of genetic diversity. And then a founder effect. A founder effect is the change in genetic composition of a population due to the origin from a small sample of individuals. So one example would be from a bottleneck. This could happen where you get a few individuals that survive and it changes the composition of the population. But another example would be when you get immigrants to an island, where they come in from a mainland or from another island and they populate, and then those populations have different allele frequencies from the mainland or from when they came from. And this is a really neat example. Researchers actually conducted an experiment about this, where they randomly chose a pair of brown anoles from a population in the Bahamas, and they put these pairs on 7 nearby islands. And then over time they went and tracked the genetic changes, and they found that there were significant genetic and morphological differences among the different island populations. So in large populations, the forces of selection, migration, and mutation are going to have a strong effect on evolution and the changes of allele frequencies in populations. And the role of genetic drift is actually going to be quite small. But in small populations, genetic drift, or these chance events, can really affect the allele frequencies, and it's going to be much more pronounced in these smaller populations. And that's it for this video.